Sorry, so much talking from me, but that's just how it's going to be today. Couple of things. I want to, in this session, talk about, towards the end of the session, I want to talk about the final assignment and just give you some feed forward in relation to that. I have learnt that we need to finish by 4 p.m. today or be out of this room at 4 p.m. today. So there is a risk that we won't have enough time to properly do schemes. So what I will do is, well, it's kind of up to you. I'll send out a time where I will record a session on the schemes and you guys can either join online or you can just wait and see the recording. Depends on how it is. Last time I did that, I only had one participant. Thank you. That was awesome, but just makes it a little bit more amusing for me and does mean that I finish it in one go instead of over-egging it. So let's just finish talking about the bid process and then we'll talk about the assignment, okay? So conditional offers. So as you now know, a conditional offer can only be made in an off-market takeover bid. So if we are making an on-market bid, then it's an offer for cash and it needs to be unconditional from the very beginning. So what kind of conditions are not prohibited? So the Act works very much with this negative language. So some examples of common takeover conditions include condition that the bidder receives acceptances in respect to a minimum percentage. So it's wanting, unless it achieves at least 50.1%, then it's not going to buy any more shares. A condition that none of the events or circumstances that are set out in the prescribed occurrences provision, so that's section 652C, that includes things like the company going into receivership, the company selling its main undertaking, significant changes in relation to the management of the operations, or significant changes in relation to the capital structure. So if any of those things happen, then the bid will be withdrawn. Condition that regulatory approvals are received. So if we need ACCC approval under section 50 because there is the potential for this transaction to have a competitive effect in a market, or if FIRB, treasurer's approvals, we call them treasurer's approvals, but actually the way it works is the treasurer basically gives that negative language and says, I'm not interested in this transaction. This is not a transaction that I'm going to take any objection to. And so receiving that notification would be a kind of common takeover condition. And when you think about it too, if a potential takeover could have a competitive impact or could bring the FATA provisions into play, then it needs to be structured as an off-market bid because those conditions are necessary for compliance with law, but they still need to be conditions. What else? Condition that there is no material adverse change in the financial position of the target company. In other words, it turns out that what we've said that we want to buy is in fact what we want to buy. And no issue of securities by the target or subsidiaries. Now that's also covered in section 652C1 and 2. So again, it sits with the prescribed occurrences. So what's important to understand with a conditional offer is it's a conditional contract. So the rules of contract law, the common law applies as augmented by the statute. So if a condition is permitted by the law of contract and not prohibited by the statute, you can include it. So we think about things like illegality, etc. here. But again, when you're making a unilateral offer, you want to have it as pretty simple and straightforward as you possibly can. And to an extent, particularly in a friendly bid, you want to have as many of the conditions dealt with in advance. A bit like a prospectus, you want to have, after you do your due diligence, you want to do as much of the cleanup as you can rather than disclose. Clearly, conditional offers only apply to off-market bids, and because in a market bid offers are accepted on market, conducted in accordance with the Securities Exchange rules, it just wouldn't be feasible to have a conditional on-market offer. We've already talked about the common conditions. Prescribed occurrence conditions, I think I've pretty much talked about those as well. Have a look at the section, but it includes things like, and these prescribed occurrences can apply in relation to withdrawing an on-market bid as well. So an on-market bid, you can't actually undo the transactions that have already happened, but you can withdraw your bid if one of the prescribed occurrences occurs. And I've just got the section in my notes here in front of me. It includes things like target converting all of their shares into a smaller or a larger number, so changing their capital, resolving to reduce share capital, entering into a buyback agreement. Now that applies to both a target and a subsidiary of the target. Issuing convertible notes, basically undertaking these kind of frustrating actions, as well as just straight liquidation, court making an order to wind up a target or the subsidiary, target ceasing to be able to pay its debts as and when they fall due, a receiver being appointed, those kinds of things. The next thing that we need to think about is defeating conditions. So Section 650G sets out the circumstances when a bidder can rescind a takeover contract or a condition. And this has the effect of rendering takeover contracts, so acceptances of offers made under an off-market bid, it basically rescinds or terminates those contracts. So the definition, in fact, of a takeover contract is a contract that results from the acceptance of an offer made under a bid. And under Section 650F, a bidder has the option to free the offers and the takeover contracts by giving notice. So effectively defeating or terminating its bid. So bidders can subsequently declare an offer to be free from a condition by giving notice to the target and to the ASX or to ASIC if the target securities aren't listed. In most cases, not less than 7 days before the end of an offer period. So effectively, offers go unconditional for a period of what is 30 days, but by 21 days and after, at that stage, if the offeror wishes, the bidder wishes, they can say, notwithstanding those conditions that we put in, we're going to waive those conditions. Works exactly the same way as it does in contract law. If at the end of the offer period the remaining conditions aren't satisfied, all acceptance under the offer will be void, no securities will be acquired. So acceptances have been made, but they will work out along the way whether they're going to continue. So the one that is most often waived is if acceptances are high, but they're not quite high enough, so they're not sitting at the 50, they will most often waive the requirement to get to 50.1, and they'll sit there with 45 or whatever it is. Often when those acceptances are waived, the market reacts by people accept anyway, because people at that stage are just holding out to see if they can get a higher price. And so if it's waived and they haven't upped the bid price, then they'll either, it's like, well, effective control is going to happen at the 40, 45. It's not much difference to 50.1. So they just go ahead with it anyway. So I mentioned before there's the prohibited conditions. So these are, just want to explore the types of conditions that you cannot include in a bid. Clearly, they only apply to off-market bids because you can't have any conditions at all with an on-market bid. So you can have a minimum acceptance condition, but you can't have a maximum acceptance condition. So the offer will terminate or the maximum consideration will be reduced if something happens. You cannot be selective about who the sellers will be. and this goes straight back to Eggleston, it needs to be equal and fair. All shareholders need to have an equal and fair right to participate. It requires a condition that requires consent to benefits for an officer. So for example, this will only go ahead if the shareholders approve to pay out the current CEO $1 million for, because he's going to lose his job, or she's going to lose her job. So those kind of conditions can't be in there. Or where the fulfilment of a defeating condition relies on someone's state of mind, belief, or opinion. So, in other words, this is almost like the contract law idea of a provision must not be illusory. So, it can't a bid can't be conditional on due diligence being to the reasonable satisfaction of the bidder. The condition might be on the accounts disclosing a profit of not less than 5% for the last financial year, but it can't be the year-end accounts being to the general satisfaction of the bidder. So an off-market bid must not contain conditions that have the effect of impacting the maximum acceptance condition, a condition that doesn't permit bidders to acquire securities from all acceptors, requires consent, or relates to the bidder's opinion or an event that the bidder can control. I think that slide just says exactly the same thing, but gives you some section numbers, not even all of them. A question that comes up quite a lot is, if you have made a bid, can you acquire securities on market? So a bidder can only purchase securities on market in excess of that 20% threshold when the offer is unconditional or is only subject to prescribed occurrences, and the bidder's statement needs to be given to the target already. If the bidder purchases securities above the prevailing price, then the offer price needs to be adjusted to go up to the higher price. Another provision that we need to be careful about is ensuring that the bidder, I'm still talking about prohibited conditions, that the bidder does not, and the associates of the bidder do not give or offer to give or agree to give any kind of benefit to one or more parties. Sorry, just quickly across. It drives me crazy. I don't know why it doesn't. Sorry to you at home who didn't see any change. The screen in the room keeps changing. So Section 623 basically prohibits, during the bid period, a bidder or their associates from giving, offering to give, etc., a benefit to any person where the benefit is likely to induce that person or their associate to accept an offer or to sell securities in the bid class, or where the benefit is not offered to all holders of securities in the bid class. This can be a bit. This is either completely obvious to you or not at all, is the way it tends to work. So, for example, if a condition or a bid offer was related to the target. So the bidder's statement has said in relation to the target, we're going to retrench a whole heap of employees, but we're going to keep these employees. And those employees might also be shareholders. Going and presenting to those shareholders very attractive employment contracts that might induce those employees to vote in favour of the bid is likely to be a collateral benefit. So it's prohibited to offer a collateral benefit of any kind. That might even be something as simple as identifying people who have parcels of 5% or more and inviting them out to dinner. providing them with some kind of collateral benefit that isn't offered to everybody. Now, I've never actually heard of that one being raised, and I'm quite sure that happens quite a lot, but technically we're talking about a collateral benefit. So ASIC has the power to grant an exemption from or to modify Section 623 under Section 655A. So one of the things that you'll see also in Chapter 6 quite often is ASIC has quite broad powers to issue class orders and to issue modifications of the law for specific circumstances. And one of the reasons for this is ultimately Eggleston, because the principles, transparency and fairness, trump meeting the letter of the law. So if the law is getting in the way of achieving transparency and fairness, then ASIC has a power to modify. And it is a really broad power which they can wield quite officiously, if I do say so myself. So there's quite a lot of guidance in relation to collateral benefits. And again, in relation to those of you who might want to focus on takeovers for the essay topic in particular, thinking about how the collateral benefits rules work with transparency, fairness, disclosure, how they all fit together, might give you an insight or an edge for thinking about your own opinion. Because critical analysis papers at the end of the day, what differentiates the credits from the distinctions and the high distinctions is your own well-formed, well-founded opinion that's supported by examples that you can see in the law and otherwise. So what do I want to say about these? So what's the principle? Equal opportunity, takeover offers should be made to everybody on the same terms. Scope of the prohibition only applies during the bid period. And this results in some anomalies because ultimately people and their associates may in fact be responding to events that happened before or after. And I think it's pretty easy to see how, particularly if a collateral benefit comes in the form of some contract or right, how it in fact is closely related to the associate reference. Because the creation of that alignment, which is either inducing people to act in some way or impacting the way that, or controlling the way that voting securities or rights over voting securities are exercised, they're very aligned principles. And then what are the conditions? Ultimately, the benefit needs to be likely to induce acceptance of an offer or a disposal of shares. And the offer needs to be something, or the benefit is something that's not offered to every other security member in the class. So what does it mean to give a benefit? It appears to extend beyond gifts to cover any case where a transaction involves a benefit of any kind to another party. It's very broad. So what's the benefit? It includes benefits by payment of cash, but other benefits as well. Particularly unhelpful definition. Having regard to the purpose of the prohibition, it's more likely that the word benefit will be read broadly by the courts. So let's have a look at some examples. Panel starts from the idea that an unacceptable circumstance, so a lot of the unacceptable circumstances cases are really going to, did a bidder offer a collateral benefit of some sort, resulting in an unacceptable circumstance that affects the legality or compliance with 606 and 611. So the questions that the panel looks at are whether it offends the equality principle, and that's usually the key issue, whether it offends the efficient, competitive, informed market principle. So in other words, is this a necessary adjunct to just ordinary business, or is it in some way affecting the way that the market in fact operates? Whether it can contravene Section 623, and whether it gives rise to the unacceptable circumstance. So ultimately, the equality principle is about equal value rather than identical dealing. So it may well be that if some parties have in some way received cash as opposed to shares, or the other way around, if there is equal value, if there is an opportunity that's only offered to some, to participate in a particular way. It's not necessarily unacceptable circumstances, but we go to the principles in each case. So once we've got a bid, we know what the conditions are, it's working through the process, how can it be changed? I mentioned a couple of times that often the price changes, and how and when can it be amended? So in relation to variation, bidders are permitted to change the terms of their offer by increasing the price or extending the offer period. You can't shorten it, other than in the limited, that 7-day window that you have towards the end. And you can't put the price down, you can only increase it. And if price is increased in an off-market bid, then the new price applies to people who have already accepted previously. Withdrawing bids, I've actually got a link to the section here, but basically off-market bids can be withdrawn in a range of circumstances. Actually, bizarrely, compared to other provisions in this law, not so, it's not a ridiculous list. So let's have a quick look. You can withdraw on the conversion of securities, so a change to the way that securities or the capital structure of the company. If there's been a buyback, it's interesting, it's a target or a subsidiary enters into a buyback or approves a scheme for that. Grants options, issues new shares, basically changes the nature of what it is that the company is buying or a bidder is seeking to buy. Then also, liquidator is applied, court makes an order to wind up the target, administrator is appointed to the target or a subsidiary, receiver appointed, those kinds of things.
So just to clarify, Kat, in the case of variation, was it that on-market bids don't necessarily give the consideration for that on-market?
With an on-market bid, the price can be increased and the offer period can be extended, but those two changes don't and can't apply to those who've already accepted because they no longer own shares. Right. The transfer has happened on market. And this is one of the reasons why with an on-market, there's a lot less control in an on-market bid from both sides. So once you accept an on-market bid, if the price goes up, and this is why there's often trading at prices that are greater than the amount that the bidder is standing in the market for. So when the bidder stands in the market, so if I am a bidder and I'm offering $1 a share, at the beginning of the day, I'm standing there with offers at $1, and anybody who matches, who's prepared to sell for $1, they match. But anybody else can come in and they can bid $1, $1, $2, $1.10, $2. It's unlikely to be that different. I could also put up my price, but if I do that, I can't put it down again, right? So it's sitting there, and then basically the offers match. So often, particularly at the beginning of an on-market bid, prices will actually be higher than the bidder standing in the market. But then, at the end of each day, during the bid period, the bidder basically has to announce. Well, they have to do it it needs to be announced before the market opens the following day, how many shares they bought and what the average price was. And so then it comes up. Yeah, but once it's done on market, it's done. So far, when we've been talking about the legal work that is associated with takeovers, we've just been talking about lots of forms and ASIC filing, and it does seem very procedural. So let's talk about some of the strategic transaction work that's necessary for a takeover bid to give effect, and some of the more interesting things that lawyers do in this space. So one of the things that needs to happen in order for a bid to work is for there to be some kind of acceptance facility in place. So in an off-market bid, basically bidders offerees are accepting bids by submitting their paperwork and basically affecting the register. So an agent generally holds the acceptance instructions on behalf of the security holder, and then when the trigger event occurs, so the completion of the offer period if it's unconditional, the completion of the satisfaction of the conditions otherwise, then the offers can no longer be withdrawn, and as a consequence, payment follows through. So there's the agency arrangement or the acceptance facility arrangements, they can be relatively complex to document from time to time. It really depends on what's going on, and the agent sort of sits there almost as an escrow agent in the market. Bidders like to do it this way because it gives them the opportunity to get press about where acceptances are flowing, etc. One of the other things is the rules basically say that if you go into the market and say, this is my last and final offer, you cannot increase that offer from that point forward. So it can be used, a last and final offer can be used to force the hand of security holders who are just holding out. So I think, in fact, that extends for another 4 months, that once you've used that language, last and final offer, you cannot increase at that stage. Where I've seen that play out most interestingly is when in off-market unlisted transactions. So if you have a company, even whether it's closely held or not, that is a public company, and you make an offer for that company where that offer would be for more than 20% of the securities, you actually have to make a takeover bid. So, in fact, the takeovers provisions in some ways replace the idea of any shareholders agreement. So it removes the need when you've got more than 50 shareholders to have preemptive rights or tag along or drag along rights, because the takeovers provisions essentially say if you've got 20% of the shares and somebody wants to buy those shares, that's going to be the creation of a new 20% controlling interest, a relevant interest in 20% of shares, which means that the takeover provision applies, and that offer for your 20% needs to be applied to everybody. So if that person only wants 20%, then they've basically got to make an offer to acquire 20% of everybody's shares. So are you looking at me like I'm a mad woman? Or it's a proportional offer.
Have you ever seen a situation where those shareholders that the company elects forgetting to have a shareholders agreement that stipulates they'll simply follow their takeover stuff?
No, I have never seen it, but I have seen many shareholders agreements that follow a very similar process for outcome. Although I have yet to see one, and it's interesting, I just turned my mind to it not that long ago. In advising on a shareholders agreement, I'm yet to see one that I can remember anyway that included a mopping up minorities provision that works the same way. So they've maintained tag and drag along rights. But yeah, is that something you've seen? No. Well, in some ways it would, because it's also easily understood, but it's also quite restrictive.
Yeah.
And shareholders really don't like the idea, particularly if the likely purchaser is an outsider, is of putting something together that says you can, if somebody makes an offer for shares, you have to tell everybody and they're not allowed to reduce that offer. Because preemptive rights do make it very difficult to sell shares. By promising to remove outstanding offer conditions or improve an offer price if a bid achieves a specified level of acceptances, bidders often basically elect further acceptances without actually having to vary anything until a relevant target is reached. So it's basically a virtual variation. So strategically can be very important. The wording needs to be very, very careful, but essentially this is all about an offeror, a bidder, saying, once we achieve this, our intention is to do that, without actually making that promise at that time. And it gives them flexibility if the conditions aren't met. Another thing strategically that happens quite often is that by reducing that, and T+2 is, it's not the big deal that it used to be, but making sure that there's actually available cash for the purchasers and removing the brokerage, ultimately the cash flow position can be structured to make the deal much more interesting to target shareholders. Removing conditions is usually something that only happens in the last week or so of an offer period. It's really there to encourage the stragglers, and it's there. Usually conditions are only removed when the bidder has achieved close enough, but what they commercially see is close enough to what it is that they were seeking to achieve. So bidders can't waive conditions other than those that relate to the prescribed occurrences, so liquidations, change in capital, those kind of things. They're not allowed to waive those conditions in the last week. So any change that they make has to be made before that time. So again, timing becomes quite critical because they want to leave that as late as they can, because the more conditions you have, the more control you have. But as a consequence, the law says, well, we're not going to let you do that at the very end period. Unless, of course, a competing bid is made or a competing bid is improved. So you can respond to changes to another bid. Okay, so delaying a decision about whether to extend an offer period or to increase an offer price in the last week of an offer can place security holders under pressure to accept the bid. But you need to be sure, if you're going to go with these kind of tactics, that you are complying with Chapter 6. Bidders can't generally elect to extend a conditional bid in that last week, but it will be extended automatically for 14 days if the if the bidder increases the offer price or reaches 50%. So again, these are all practical efficiency measures. They can be a little bit confusing to follow through, but really, if you think about what the aim of them is, it's to basically allow target security holders to compare apples with apples. So if a new bid comes in, if there is a change in circumstances, or if suddenly there is a rise so that we're going over that 50% majority, there is a consistent way that these transactions will be addressed. So what kind of things do we need to think about if we are acting for the target of a company? I like this quote. Again, I highly recommend this King and Wood Mallison's Takeovers Guide. I think it's a really nice, simple way of understanding what the transactions involve. The overriding principle of a response strategy should not simply be to deter potential bidders, but rather to ensure that if control is going to pass, the transfer occurs on favourable terms and at a price that reflects the true underlying value of the company. So the response, well, what is the key responsibility of directors?
Act in the best interest of the company.
Act in the best interest of the company. Acting in the best interest of the company in many, many cases means acting in the best interest of shareholders, but not only. There are many circumstances where acting in the best interest of the company means acting in the best interest of creditors, acting in the best interest of the sustainable goals of a company to remain alive. So that includes things like paying taxes, paying employees, putting superannuation aside, etc. So overriding principle when it comes to a takeover bid, because and what we've seen as the law has developed is that directors can be all about maintaining their own position, particularly founding directors and executive directors, but not only. that a bidder, an outsider coming in and trying to take over a company, can be seen as an attack. And I think this puts it really nicely without making too much of a moral statement about it. But the role of directors is to act in the best interest of the company. And that means if controlling the company is going to change, ensuring that it does so on the right terms at a price that reflects value. And spending money and defending for defending's sake is not appropriate conduct. So, kinds of things that target directors need to think about include, it can actually be being proactive. Let me see if I can turn this on and magnify a little bit. What's going on? Oh, my Bluetooth's not turned on, that's why. Sorry. So, no, I thought I might have something pretty similar, and my eyesight's not good enough to to follow here. So some of the things that directors need to be doing, listed company directors in particular, they need to be aware of who potential bidders for their company might be. It's something that most boards will be doing, that a report that will be presented at most board meetings would include monitoring activities about what's happening with competitors, what's happening with other companies in the market. Is our volume-weighted trading similar, different to other companies in this industry? Every board meeting I've ever been to includes a report to the directors that shows substantial the trends in changing of interests. So the share registries will produce a report that goes to the board that shows whether or not somebody is creeping, for example, whether there are new shareholders on the register that people don't know, so that, because companies are basically being vigilant, seeing what's going on. Identifying who the supportive parties are. Usually boards are very anxious to make sure that that's not creating associations where no association should be created, but really analysing who's on the side of the board and the strategy, which investors are on side, listening to the concerns of shareholders, etc. I mentioned monitoring trading. Training for board directors is really important, and often that is best done before a bid has arisen, and also so that they know when the kind of conduct that they have in discussion with shareholders may or may not be an unacceptable circumstance. Part of what all boards, I think, should be doing is communicating companies' value to the market. Continuous disclosure is a compliance obligation, but it is also a way that companies demonstrate what their value is to the market generally. Most company secretaries will have a kind of response manual, so there will be a procedure that's to be followed if a bidder statement is received. And again, companies, particularly CEOs and CFOs, developing relationships with brokers and those who put together investment reports in relation to the companies, so that they know that they can answer questions if they arise, that they can maintain what's actually happening in the market. So some preemptive defence strategies, things that companies do to make sure that they are not targets, includes their own acquisition strategies, continual growth, being an attractive investment for a diverse range of shareholders. They can amend capital structure. So sometimes changing a capital structure can be a defensive strategy because it makes the bidder's task more difficult. So pro rata issues of securities, increasing the number of shares, issuing convertible notes, those kind of things, the prescribed conditions that we were referring to earlier. Less common now, but it used to be quite common to have what are referred to as poison pills. So a provision in the company's constitution, for example, so some sort of capital structure provision or preemptive right that provided for the issue of new shares in an adverse circumstance. So if a takeover came along, for example, to issue new shares. Now, the listing rules make it very difficult to do that anymore. But they're still relatively common in off-market unlisted companies, that they will build in a defence mechanism into their constitution or their shareholder agreement.
I think there was a case on good faith and that kind of arrangement. I can't recall what it was.
It's terrible looking at me for a case name. That's not. So there've been a number of cases in relation to, and in fact, some of the law that has developed, particularly in relation to whether or not there is a general duty of good faith in contracting, has arisen out of defence strategies in takeovers. So because as you know, a constitution is a contract between the company and its members. So the provision in a contract of a provision that can be a defence mechanism could in fact be a bad faith provision for the shareholders. Because what it is doing is it's protecting the insiders, potentially at the expense of the outsiders.
I think it's criticised a lot as the cross-shareholding privilege.
Yes.
But I've been in place so long.
So absolutely. And so but they have associate references as a consequence, and so it's well known and well understood. But again, because of the way that when we looked at the tracing before, when you have a really complex structure or shareholding structure, you can be in the position where entities higher in the structure can in fact make bids for or acquire relevant interests lower down in the structure, which their subsidiaries would be prohibited from doing because of the way the tracing actions work, which in fact, even though they don't necessarily do it, that's a defensive strategy, right? Because the shareholding itself is so locked up into a small number of affiliated, if not associated entities. One that is much more common and can be defensive from the point of view of management staff in particular are golden parachute rules. So CEOs, CFOs, if only general counsel, who receive very large or have contractual rights to very large payouts if there is a change of control, and may even have a right to terminate their employment contract and walk on a change of control, and basically then realising significant capital from the company at the same event. Some of these things, they have very creative names, I think. The shark repellent. So including a provision in a company's constitution that causes the company to be less attractive or as a target. So a percentage restriction on acquiring securities or restrictions on shareholders to convene general meetings, etc. Again, more difficult to do with an ASX listed company than in the unlisted environment, but these mechanisms still exist to an extent. So one of the things, and I'm sure I mentioned it when we talked about listing, is in order for a company to be listed, it has to have a constitution that is acceptable to the ASX for a listed company or a listed entity. And mostly these days that happens by the company adopting a couple of provisions in its constitution that effectively say, to the extent that there is an inconsistency between anything in this constitution and the listing rules, and the company is listed, then the listing rules win. So what kind of strategies and tactics are used when a bid is in fact made? So one of the things that often happens is the directors will come out screaming, it's inadequate, it's opportunistic, it's not commercially desirable, these people are just having a go, maybe they can't even pay for it. So often directors will be highlighting things like the price isn't right. They'll be rejecting on basis of price. They will reject on the basis of what they say that future earnings should be. They might reject on a lack of understanding or belief in what it is that the bidder might actually be able to achieve. If the fundamental value estimated by an expert or the strategic importance of the value of the company aren't taken into account, or the directors don't believe these things are taken into account, they will really push on those factors. One of the things directors need to be really cognizant of here is their obligations are to the company. And that includes not being misleading or deceptive about the company, its operations, its values, and the rights attaching to securities, which push out in a listed company situation. Corporation Act will capture that for statements that are made about the company that might induce a person to buy or sell securities. So that would include prospective investors. It's great if directors can get an expert to agree with them. An independent expert's report is only actually required if the bidder holds more than 30% or has common directors at the time that the bid is made. But often, independent experts' reports are voluntarily included because they help justify and add credibility to the response to an offer. And that can go either way when they're rejecting or accepting. If a consideration is shares, one of the things that directors need to do is address and satisfy themselves as to the value of the shares that are being offered as consideration. And so often that plays out as a criticism of the value, criticism of the management, criticism of the strategy, concerns about inability to increase the bid or cash constraints or changes to the way that the group might be run. Again, those same sort of directors' duties are going to apply, and they do need to tread with some care. Other ways that directors can deal with this is, from a defence point of view, is often they are releasing the favourable news. Most listed companies will have engagement arrangements with PR companies, influencers, shareholder activist or shareholder engagement liaison. Other strategies can be straight out commercial. They can start increasing dividends, show their value in that way. They can think about capital returns, which again, a capital return could be structured in a way that creates a prescribed occurrence which could bring the bid to an end as well. So again, directors need to think about what a company can do to make shareholders want to stick with the current management or ownership structure. And there are plenty of different ways to do that. And sometimes it's also about just courting another bidder, a white knight, or really engaging with the loyalty of the shareholders. A company that historically has been really good at that, as engaging with shareholder loyalty, would be News Limited. So even though a very small number of people hold the super voting majority in that company, it has a very loyal and consistent shareholder base, largely because it pays a good dividend. Gets a fair few activists these days for other reasons now. Of course, directors and companies will, if they need to, appeal to the courts, to the panel, or to other regulators. So if we've got a hostile takeover, it's quite common for the target and the advisors to have a really detailed look at the documents, and if they can find anything that could be the basis of an application to the takeovers panel, that there are unacceptable circumstances or a complaint to ASIC, they will do that. If they have to take it to ACCC, they will do that. So targets can also lobby specific regulators that have the ability to directly or indirectly influence the outcome of a bid. So in particular, the one I see used most there is the ACCC. So in financial services, for example, been a range of takeovers in recent times. So IOOF last year or earlier this year, can't remember now, took over part of ANZ's wealth business. And so the competition regulator, clearly there's part of a push in relation to that. I mean, that was not a hostile takeover. That was we need to get rid of this business, otherwise the Royal Commission will kill us kind of sale of assets. But even so, looking at it from the point of view of a competition issue, competitors and other potential bidders for that asset were pushing the ACCC to go and ask competition questions in relation to that one. And there is what I think is very charmingly called the Pacman Defence. Another common defensive approach is to actually make a corresponding bid back. So a defensive bid is likely to trigger a defeating condition of the initial bid and may in fact be a frustrating action. So it can lead to litigation and another round of unacceptable circumstances claims.